Hi there, this is Tim,
And Keaton Clark, first year painting student.
and today we're looking at painting a nose feature study here, our second painting in the portrait section of our program here. We're going to paint it similar to how the eye was painted in that it's going to be a more studied painting. There's going to be some key differences we're going to see here. You'll notice that I'm not starting with a linear drawing. I'm going to try to do more of my sculpting with the underpainting, mostly because I feel that the shapes are a little more simple than with the eye. I don't think it's going to demand quite as much of a linear drawing, but of course, if you're working on this on your own, you should do as much drawing as you feel necessary to be comfortable with the form. Not drawing of details, but drawing of the shadow. So I'm starting in with a little bit of burnt sienna and ultramarine blue, which is producing pretty much an umber similar to the underpainting of the eye that we saw last video. We're just going to see a little bit more variety in the underpainting color ultimately. And so I'm starting this video or this painting drawing here actually with the shadow portion of the nose. So that's going to be the bottom plane of the nose, and then maybe some of the cast shadow onto the philtrum before moving up to the lighter side of the nose, which is actually, in this case, lighter than the toning of the canvas. So I may knock it in with a few initial scheme lines, but ultimately I'll come in and erase into the tone of the canvas to get some of those lights. But first I really want to lock in onto the shape of the underside of the nose here. Really key that nice and strong so I can be a little more confident and accurate with some of the statements that are going to go on top. And I'm just using my, actually a rosemary mongoose brush here to lay some of that in. Notice I'm keeping my lines and marks and shapes for the most part really straight, no curvatures now. We're actually going to see quite a bit of little subtle curvatures towards the end of the painting here, but I'm going to keep everything nice and straight for now to help ensure that I don't create excess curves in the painting. And you saw me just take an angle right now from the keystone to the wing of the nostril there to ensure that that's shaped up correctly. Unfortunately, I can't use sight size for this painting. I am about 15 feet or so, maybe a little further from the model. So I am actually seeing the model very, very small. And so sight size is not going to be useful to me. I'm going to have to rely mostly on angles and a little bit of comparative measurement here.
That was fast. You got the drawing in there very quickly.
Well, I don't know, 3 minutes is, for this level of build-up is, I think, more than enough. If you're working at home, maybe 5 or 10 minutes should be solid. If you've done enough of your drawing exercises, we were practicing doing 20 or 25-minute feature study drawings. So our goal was to get that notan in the first 5 or 10 minutes. So this isn't much different. It's just that the notan is significantly less complex than the other ones that we're going to see here. So again, you should isolate what is the real struggle you're having with each of these. Is it the drawing aspect? Are you taking an inordinately large amount of time getting that initial block in? If so, maybe you need to refocus on some drawing. I'm working into the toning of the canvas with some mineral spirits on my badger brush here, and I'm actually just digging into it and lifting off some of the toning. And now this toning is pretty old. I mean, it's more than a week old. It's been laid in quite a while ago, but this is on a canvas that's been double or triple primed with an oil alkyd primer. And it's already a linen canvas here, and with a lot of oil primer it makes this thin coat of the toning, which was just done with paint with some thinner, very workable and very removable. It's super, super thin, and so I can just dig right into it to get the value. It's as though now I'm working with my light brush or my light chalk pencil here, just to create some of the form, just lifting out where it needs to go lighter than the toning of the canvas. So this should give me an immediate sense of the volume of the nose and some of the shapes of the nose, key my values right away, ultimately make the painting much easier to paint. And of course, by solving all these drawing issues right now, it's going to allow me to focus in this next section here, even more so than I was able to do on the eye, with just putting in big broad patches of really rich color to describe all of the planes and turning of the form. Notice how I'm trying to get really specific with some of those little contours and edges here. Not painting them though as if they were lines, but kind of digging into them to sort of shape them, almost as if I'm just sculpting those little contours.
Does the photo make it kind of difficult to see where that edge is?
Yeah, yeah, super difficult. Unfortunately, the photo took more of the scene into account, and so the exposure on the nose isn't as good as it could have been. Whereas, you know, when I or anyone else in the open studio is looking up at the model, especially at one feature like the nose, you know, it resets how we perceive the lights to be a little bit darker, more at a level that we can interpret color and information more accurately, whereas the photo, just especially from a distance that I was at, just took that that light in context to the rest of the environment, which, you know, really kind of blows it out. And so I would have had to actually get really quite a bit closer and adjust some of the exposures to lock in onto just that nose. Then it would have the potential risk of making everything else, such as the shadow part of the nose, so dark that it would be almost impossible to see information in. And again, there's nothing wrong with painting the value structure like how we see it in the photo. That is more of an optical style of painting, as if it were impressionistic, you know, really losing that edge of the nose into the cheek. That is how a more impressionistic, more direct painter would opt to handle that. But again, this is a more studied feature. We're trying to coax out some of the anatomy. We want things to be clear more so than obscure, and so finding that contour of the nose is kind of paramount in that idea. And this is something similar to what the academics would do also, you know, doing these studies of features and of portraits and of pieces of anatomy that actually are more detailed with more information and more color information. And then in the final, as it's being adapted to a larger piece and put into context, that's when you'd start to lose all those edges, merge colors, simplify things a lot more, and even make some things even looser than in the more studied painting. But it's more difficult to do that if you don't have that initial information there to guide you. Going to spend, for the most part, this whole first sitting figuring out the drawing, you know, similar to what I did with the eye here. It's one of these instances where I know I have a full session with the model. You know, we run to a little over 2 hours of working time in this 3-hour session. And so I don't need to rush the drawing, even though I laid down those initial marks really, really fast. I understand that that's where a lot of students would jump from the drawing into the painting, but I'm opting to guide myself with more information. You know, I finished a little bit ahead of schedule, a little bit ahead of the first break, and so I just took that opportunity to slow down a little and get more precise with some of the angles, with some of the carving, with some of the value modulation here, so I could really give myself a super strong foundation to lay the color on top of. There's nothing wrong with trying to, you know, after you get something that you deem as a student to be, oh, that's good enough, there's nothing wrong with taking an extra 5 minutes to say, well, how can I really make it better? And not just push it back and forth, but really advance it further. You know, there's a real difference there. there's just the tiniest amount of terp on my brush, and I'm using it to work over that whole broad side of the upper lateral cartilage just to soften out some of those transitions. Now going in, still thinner on the brush, using that thinner to carve out the lower lateral cartilage as the ball of the nose. Now that I've adequately built up some information in the lights, I can start to carve in a little bit to the darks and describe a little bit more information. Even though when I paint it in, the value structure is going to be really tight there, and it's mostly going to be modeled with color. Working on this toned canvas makes it really nice and quick to create a monochrome that's pretty three-dimensional. I will say, though, it tends to work a little better when you're going for the more formal, classical, or academic type of modeling as opposed to like a looser Schmid-style monochrome, which kind of relies on a lot of abstraction in the initial toning. But this is what we'll see when we look forward at the 3-session figure painting in the next course. And that 3-session figure painting is actually, what you see is actually a 2-session figure painting, because the first session was utilized to figure out a shadow map on a piece of paper, and then there was a transfer, and it was built into a monochrome using this very technique. So I don't actually show that technique because a lot of the modeling was done even without the model there, because the shadow map was strong enough. So it was just sort of a simplified version of this before bringing out the model and finishing the rest of that underpainting. So this technique, working on this toned canvas, working it like a charcoal and white chalk drawing, it's very effective, produces really quick results with a lot of volume right away. So you've got to figure out that whole transition from light to dark there. That terminator is going to completely describe the whole shape of the ball of the nose and the wing of the nose. Nice thing about doing an underpainting like this too early on especially is that I don't have to keep dipping back into my puddle every time I want to make a stroke on there. Because I'm working in monochrome, I can actually model it a lot more as like I'm using a pencil instead of having to dip in and get a new piece of color each time. And so this allows me to get through the drawing much faster. It's always harder to do the drawing at the same time as you do the color, because you have to dip into the color every time you want to make a different shape change. And so that takes a lot of time, and it becomes really difficult to ensure you're getting the correct shape while getting the correct color. Whereas here, I don't have to worry about the whole licking thing. I can just massage and push and work this paint around as much as I want because it's all just one color. And I can think more fully about just the drawing, just the shape, value, and edge before I start to think about this idea where, oh, I can only make 1 or 2 strokes and then I have to keep mixing.
How do you decide which color to use for the underpainting?
I'm just trying to find a generalized color of kind of what I see up on the model. Usually it typically leans a little more of a reddish brown with flesh tone, because I can allow that to sort of sparkle through. But it kind of depends, and I sort of gauge it often on how much transparency I'm anticipating. or how solidly I want to paint things. But there's no real right or wrong answer. It's not going to make or break the painting. But starting out with this sort of dark brown, which is kind of what I'm observing. I'm actually observing and trying to paint the dark brown without the little specks of chroma that are making the darks look really rich and brilliant. Sort of trying to omit those. And that's sort of what I'm utilizing and selecting. And so the amount of chroma or redness or grayness of that brown kind of shifts from painting to painting based off of what I'm observing, but it's generally the shadow side minus those little bits of chroma that help it spike up. And sometimes it's an actual color. It just depends on if I'm doing a closed grisaille, or I'm sorry, an open grisaille underpainting or an abache underpainting.
Oh, so for an abache, you'd use a higher hue color?
Yeah, I would try to do more of a kind of average, or potentially even block it in with leaning towards the more higher chroma of the variations of color that I see, as opposed to a lower chroma, sort of standard monochrome. But again, there's a lot of danger there, because if you develop an abache with areas all over, and your chromas are off, or your major color families are off, or even your values are off, it can set you in a really wrong key right away. So it's a little more challenging to do that. Only something that was done starting in the 19th century for the most part, and later. I want to zero in on my values here, so I've actually laid in some value keys. I'm actually pretty surprised I didn't do that for the first painting we did of the eye. Although that painting that we did of the eye, the previous one that we filmed, actually was under a more natural light, and so I actually had the same light on my canvas as I had on the model. It was more easy to direct, observe, and mix the color and value that I saw. Here we have a spotlight on the model that's pretty intense, and so my canvas is under a substantially different light than the model is under. And in fact, it's interesting to note that we did have to key down the value of the reference photo a little bit, because what you can see on the sides of my canvas, so the people working around me in the open studio, it's so light back there that if we took a picture of the model and the background looked that light, then the model would look so light that you would see nothing. The face would be completely white and blown out. So everything has to be keyed a little bit. So what I'm seeing up on the model is a value structure that's so much more expanded than what's on my canvas, that I'm having to ensure that my values are correct. And I do that by setting the white and dark mark. Even though we've adjusted the reference photo to be a value that matches what I'm painting, so you can see a more direct translation. And now we're going into some color mixing. I'm utilizing the same method of mixture that I used in the last video here, where I've got the groups of red, yellow, and blue. And I'm going to try and scrub in some color that's pretty high key, close to the chroma right away, and close to the color family right away, that as I can get to the model. And so I'm using pure paint here, really just laying more intense chroma in, and every couple of brush strokes I'm going to pick up and modulate my color a little bit more. Now keep in mind, with this type of mixing, I'm anticipating that I'm going to have to go back over and adjust. So what I'm laying down is kind of an average of what I'm observing. Obviously not every tiny little shape that I'm observing. It's kind of me looking up at the model, letting my eyes go out of focus, and seeing the general color and chroma of that area, and laying it down, minus any specific smaller bits of information here. So I got a small amount of medium in here actually right now.
Is the previous painting throwing you off at all?
No, I'm not really looking at it.
Okay.
I'm doing a lot more isolation, really zeroing in and focusing. I'm not doing physical isolation with an isolator, which I recommend students always do. But over the years, you'll find that you develop a skill to be able to sort of block out all the surrounding information and isolate a little bit better under most situations, and then just more occasionally grab the physical isolator. So I'm really sort of blocking out what I'm seeing from the eye, which is a completely different lighting condition. Natural light versus a sort of an incandescent yellow light are two intensely different situations. And I'm just trying to zero in on the color I see when I squint down at the model. But what we're going to see by the time we get to the end of this painting and look at my palette is that the colors are going to look almost the same. It's just it's going to be a higher chroma overall, and that kind of dictates the lighting condition that we're utilizing. It's all just red and yellow and blue, with the same premise of jumping up to my my appropriately valued families of red, yellow, and blue.
The nose is going to be the same value as the thigh, you said?
Almost. It'll be a little lighter in general because we are getting more highlights, a little more intense center lights.
Okay.
But overall, aside from a value step or half a value step, they're going to be pretty much the same.
That's surprising.
Yeah. I do encourage you, you have the final images here at home of all these features. If you can put them into black and white, you'll see how really close they are in value. I mean, they're not identical in value, obviously, but they are pretty close in value. And it just goes to show you how important the idea of edge quality and chroma are in describing the lighting quality. And we don't tend to think of it as much. So if you get flesh tones that are too chalky and washed out on something like this, it definitely won't look like a painting of somebody under an intense yellow spotlight. Two clear, distinct things that are creating what we see here. The intensity creates the edge quality and the more distinct highlights, and thus a little bit lighter value in some area. And then the chroma is creating the Kelvin of the light largely. Along with, it is a little more orange in general, but it's mostly just that higher chroma that creates that more incandescent yellow light look. So you can see as I mix down in here, I'm getting pretty close to some of the values we were using on that eye. It's just so much more yellow. So even less blue. In this case, the white that I'm adding is sufficient to act as a blue to cool off or counterbalance the amount of red and yellow there.
Because it's so warm?
Well, just the direct yellow and red can be so orange that you can end up painting somebody who looks like an Oompa Loompa. And the white tends to knock some of that down and coax out more of the subtle pinks. I can immediately see as I start to lay down this lighter color for the ball of the nose how dark I did go in my initial marks of the side planes and the front plane of the nose. So I'm going to end up building on top of that and raising the value here. I'm kind of following the planes of the nose. I sort of see how that cartilage there looks like it's going from left to right, so I made some strokes going from left to right as that skin is sort of pulled around it. But I'm primarily thinking of this more in terms of large abstract patches. It's always good to point out as a reminder just how big my puddles of paint that I'm mixing are relative to how small of an area that I'm painting. Most students I know, when going to paint something the size of this nose, which it's a little larger than life size, but it's still a relatively small portion of my canvas here, would be using tiny puddles of paint because they're painting something that they perceive as being tiny. Whereas I do the opposite. The smaller this, or the more refined this all needs to be, the bigger the puddle of paint needs to be so I can get all of that subtlety in there.
You're also using what I think would be a big brush, but it looks like you're on the edge of it mostly.
Yeah, I'm adjusting the angle of attack of that brush to really create a variety of shape sizes in here. And if you handle your brushes well enough, you should be able to do just about an entire painting with just a couple brushes, and it should still look good and varied. If you remember that there's lots of ways you can lay paint down. This works especially well with the Rosemary Master's Choice brushes that are flat because they can come to a chiseled edge. You can kind of you cram them into a point, and you can get it into a big broad shape, and you can go at sort of an angle also. So you can get all sorts of different little marks with it, depending on how you fan it out or smash it in, and it can create all that variety that you need to make a more natural looking painting. But that should also allow you to utilize a bigger brush than you think you need for a longer period of time, which will help you focus on the macro, even if you're thinking about the micro also. There is some intense chroma as that wing turns down into the shadow, so we're going to try and lock in onto some of that. The chroma will describe often the quality of the flesh tone, how transparent it is, how much light is passing through it, how solid it is, how shiny it is, a lot of that sort of stuff. So we need to pay attention to all that chroma. In the ear, oftentimes we see spikes in chroma because there's so much transparency and light bouncing around in the ear, so we have to pay special attention there. But we can also often see it on the wings of the nose. That white and dark mark on the left now are pretty instrumental for me here as I start to lay these colors in to make sure I don't blow out past the value that I need to paint. There's objects up on the scene there, and a skeleton in the background which is white, and these white objects I can use to act as my balance. So I look at the white object up near the model, and then I see how much darker the shape is that I'm trying to paint, and then I look at the white piece that I've laid down on my canvas, and then I determine how much darker I need to mix a color to have the correct jump in value, so that as I'm laying all these lights in, I make sure that I don't get them too light and thus kill the chroma. I make sure they stay nice and rich. This is interesting. The last painting we did, I had a transition from dark on the left to light on the right, and now I'm doing dark on the top to light on the bottom. It ends up being almost different every painting I do. So I have to go into those darks and really boost the chroma in there. Otherwise, they will get flat or look like lines just drawn on the model's face. Sometimes, and those are the ones I would say that are the most difficult to see. These little tiny pieces, sometimes we just observe them as just being a flat dark and lay them in like that, and that really kills all of the volume.
I really don't know how you're seeing such small variation like that when the model's so far away. It feels like you're making it up, but like next to the photo reference, it's pretty much all there.
Yeah, that's those years, all those years in there. I mean, if you're consciously aware of it, then every painting you do, you'll force yourself to see a little bit more and a little bit more. But it is very much a training thing, a learning thing. It's, just like a musician getting better and better over the years at being able to hear subtle variations in notes and pitch, and being able to hear an instrument and see that just one particular string or note is out of key and the instrument needs to be tuned. That's essentially what we're doing, but for our eyes here. And it's one of those things, especially that to someone who can't really comprehend or doesn't really tend to think about the amount of training that has to go into something like this, it just appears like magic. And this is where we get this whole idea that people are gifted. Some people have a natural propensity to be able to see and observe a little more carefully, or to think a little bit more thoughtfully, and that gives them an edge. But then beyond that, it's just so much training that goes into it to fine-tune your senses to be able to take it to this level. Your sense of touch to be able to lay paint down, your sense of vision to be able to see nuances in color. It's all just practice, 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 and it's that sort of practice that we don't have to do in everyday skills, and so we don't really think about the fact that there are some professions or things we do that require so much training every day to be able to get to that level. It's almost this mountain of work that is so overwhelming that honestly, if I had known about it when I first started, I might not have jumped into it. But it does require a lot of consistent training, like nothing I think most people have ever done before.
Did you have one thing that kept you kind of focused and practicing? I guess in the middle of it, did you see how much work was ahead of you?
Probably not for a long time. And I kind of had what I think a lot of young artists tend to have, and I think one of the reasons why younger artists tend to ultimately be really successful is sort of a misplaced confidence that older people who have had a career and experience with life tend to be a little more reasonable, whereas younger people tend to look at something and say, oh yeah, I can do that, whatever, and then they just jump right into it. And so you have this balance, I think, of this idea where you look at something you do and say, hey man, that's really good, I'm pretty good, yeah, I should keep doing this. That's always just always edges out that whole, oh my god, there's so much learning to do for me to get to this level. And you have to have that. You have to have enough of that confidence and self-satisfaction with your work that it overcomes the insurmountable odds against you, and it drives you to go forward. And then I think as you get older as an artist, you can start to kind of accept this idea that, oh wow, there's a never-ending learning process associated with it, and there's no real end goal. It's just I'm going to continue to get better and better and better, and you can sort of ease into that. But if you start with that mindset, then you sort of linger at some of these beginning stages for so long that you never actually advance. So I think you do have to have that confidence and that sort of desire, and some of it a little bit of blind confidence even sometimes, where you don't see just how bad some of your stuff is, and you drive forward. You just have to be able to see a little bit of the bad qualities of your work in small doses so that you can kind of manage them and overcome them the next time, as opposed to just looking at a painting and saying, oh my gosh, there are so many millions of things wrong with this that I don't even know where to begin the next time I paint. It's better to look at it and say, wow, this is a pretty good painting. If next time I just adjusted my edges a little bit more around this area, then it would be even better. And then you do that. Then the next time you say, oh, this is a really good painting, and I did the edges better, but if I just adjusted this a little more next time, it'll be even better. And then you slowly advance that way. And that can help alleviate some of that overwhelming task of learning and observation and never-endingness that's associated with painting. And I do know some people who have quit pretty early on when they realized how much work was actually involved in becoming a painter at this level. And there's nothing wrong with that. We're not all destined to be at this level or to have that attitude to almost masochistic attitude to drive ourselves every day to get to this level. Even people I know with a natural propensity for drawing or even color. My wife actually has a degree in drawing, and she's quite a skilled draftsman. She's even done some paintings that were pretty nice, and she saw how much work I was having to do to get to the level I was, and she realized there was other stuff she'd rather do with her time and with her life than work this hard to get to this level. And so she pursued other areas of interest. And there's nothing wrong with that. That is the reason why everybody's not an artist. If it was just about watching something or reading a few books and then being able to do all that stuff, then everybody would do it. But to continually refine your skills, advance your skills, get to this high level, it's just a lot of work. And luckily, like I said, I didn't really know that going in. I looked at some paintings, and I said, oh, well, that person did it, and they're just a person like me. So if they could do it, there's no reason I can't do it. And then I just jumped right into it from there.
You keep saying confidence, but it almost sounds like ignorance.
Ignorance, yeah. Ignorance, arrogance, misplaced confidence. I think, as Salvador Dali says, every artist needs a healthy dose of megalomania. And there is, I think, some truth to that statement, because it is that self-righteousness that sort of causes us to create things. It's this whole like, oh, well, I can make something beautiful. I want to make something beautiful. And the pride in it. It's just like we are when we're children and we do a drawing that we're really proud of and we come home to show it to people. We don't know that there's anything wrong with it. And, if we're encouraged, then that tends to blossom into an interest in art. And if your parents tell you, oh, well, that's terrible, why were you even showing me this? Then you might immediately be dissuaded from that avenue. And, to some degree, you have to have that personality trait within you. And I've noticed that those people that do tend to push themselves pretty far, pretty fast. And those that don't can still arrive, but it's just a more gentle, slow boat to that skill level.
It's funny, in the last video you mentioned that some of the best artists are humble, so it sounds
but
like...
not in the beginning.
Not in the beginning. It sounds like that's something that's learned.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. And I think it's when you come to this realization later on down the road that you're probably never going to be the best at it, when that may be something that drove you in the beginning, or you'll never reach an end goal. I think that's the realization you come to. We always have these spots in our mind, these sort of landmarks where we think, oh, well, if I can just do this, or if I just get this, or if I just get in this magazine, or if I just get in these galleries, or if I just do this, I'll have made it. And then you get all that stuff and you realize, well, there's more work to be done and we must keep going. And it's coming to that realization that you tend to learn this role of admiring other work and other people's work and other people's skill sets, and then shifting over to this, well, if I want to get better, I need to start learning from all these other people. Even if I don't consider them to be maybe as technically skillful as me, they may have something to offer. And so then you start to adopt this more humble role and advance your skill set even further. I do have a lot more higher chroma pieces of paint in this painting than the last, so I did clean off my palette a little bit so I can start digging into some more colorful colors even, and really retain some high chroma highlights and center planes here.
It seems like you have a really red band that goes across the nose.
Yeah, it'll start to get knocked down here, but it does take on a more red hue that's distinct from the ball of the nose. I think it's just because that plane, as it's angled down, is at a slightly different angle to the light source, so it's taking on less direct influence from the color of the light source, more of a natural pinkish tone versus the really strong yellow tone that the flesh is getting when it's more directly pointed towards the light. So notice I'm doing all of this modeling with just two colors in white because I'm keeping that chroma really, really high, and everything's dancing between the yellow-red family here.
Do you have some of your off-whites laid out?
No, not in this video. If I did, I'd be painting most of this with those. Or at least starting with those as a base tone and then tinting it with the cad red light or the cad yellow light as needed. So here I'm digging into some fresh white paint that has not been dipped into at all, so I can keep a cleaner, higher note. If you're struggling with maintaining that chroma in high values, just remember the key here is 1 or 2 colors and then utilizing white that has been untouched by your brush previously. That'll keep your white clean and thus your colors cleaner, and then the sticking to 1 or 2 colors will keep your chroma high and in 1 or 2 families. I have transitioned to the body paint phase of the painting here. I laid in with a little bit of medium early on to lay in some of the strokes, and now I'm using my mongoose brush and really just trying to lay in a little more body, a little more direct thickness, direct consistency of the paint, which I'll be able to almost sculpt, especially as I get to these highlights. More so than in the last painting, I'm actually going to build this one up a little more sculptural and build up some texture in the highlights to give it a little more dimension. And again, it just represents a slightly different finish you can attempt to achieve. You know, the previous video being more of a classical smooth finish, this one being a little more of almost a Rembrandt style buildup of the paint.
Yeah, it gets pretty thick in the highlights.
Yeah.
It seems like so much red on the palette, but then on the
It sure
canvas
does.
it's all in context.
Yeah. And part of it too is I'm anticipating that there will be just a tiny bit of mixture with the colors underneath, depending on how thick I build up the paint. But what will often happen is I'll lay in a color that I think is going to be too chromatic and then realize it wasn't chromatic enough. And so I lay in more of a pure color, and then that gently mixes. So I have to almost do a test stroke, and then I see, oh, well, it's going to go higher chroma. And then what my palette appears to be is just really heavily blown towards one color. But it mixes gently in the context. And it's, you know, one of those reminders that sometimes it's difficult to just mix a color in isolation, or just mix a color without isolating even, because we tend to, our brain will adjust what we're seeing. If you have a painting that's truly built up in good context and you isolate it, you may see colors on that painting that don't look like they belong there without the context of the rest of the painting. I'm starting to find as I raise the value up more and more on the side plane of my nose, how much lighter I can actually go in to that dark accent with. As long as I keep the chroma high, I'll be able to raise the value just a little bit.
If you wanted to isolate a small shape like that, would you have to get like right next to the model? And,
yeah. There's not really another way around it. And even then, you can almost never isolate a single tiny piece on its own. you end up isolating a little bit of the contextual area around it, but that can at least key you in the right direction on your palette.
Yeah, and even within that shape, there's more variation.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's why I really highly recommend working these up close at first, and then as you develop skill, you can work further away when you're kind of guided as to what you need to see. But I see too many people just learning in the beginning. They don't know any better. Going to open studios and then sitting 10 to 20 feet away from the model, and then not realizing that part of the reason why they're having so much trouble is they're just not able to see enough. And so they're relying too much on what they know, and what they know isn't necessarily accurate. And so it sort of sets them down a path of just reinforcing bad color choices and bad value choices and edge choices. Whereas if you go the opposite, where you start really close and you can eventually work further and further away and have more success.
Mm-hmm. Something I kind of found in open studios is that people don't really like profile views. So you can like get up right next to it.
Yeah, I found that too, which is interesting because I tend to really, really like profiles. I think from what I've talked to, a lot of professional artists tend to really like profiles too. But for some reason, a lot of people in open studios hate the profile. And that spot, at least in open studios that I've gone to over the last 5 years, has almost always been free. Yeah. And so I, like you, use that opportunity to push my easel, 3 or 4 feet from the model, whereas even the closest people in the front row are still 5 or 6 feet away. And so I can really get close and really see a lot of information. And the downside to this, if you're not familiar with open studios, is that typically you're in really bad light if you do that. You end up being outside of the light that's on most of the easels, and you're sort of off in the dark on your own. But sometimes you can angle your canvas to catch some light from the rest of the studio. Sometimes you can use a small LED to illuminate your canvas without bothering the other people in the studio. But even so, even without either of those two options, getting that close, even if you have a harder time seeing your canvas, will definitely help you make better choices in terms of shape, value, and edge. Your color choices may be a little bit off, and your value choices may be a little off because you're not quite in the same lighting condition, but certainly your painting will be much, much better, even if you can't see your canvas quite as well, just by being able to see the model. Especially if you're drawing. If you're drawing, you don't need to see color. You can get right up really close, learn how to key your values appropriately, like I'm doing with the white and dark here. In a case like this, they blasted the light so intensely on the model, and they usually do this in open studio cases, that even though there's lights on in the rest of the studio, the light on your canvas does not even come close to the amount of light on the model. And so at that point, it's like, well, you might as well lose a few lumens and push your canvas closer to the model and be able to see the model more. But I've got probably half of my paintings, my portrait paintings from the palette and chisel, are profile views.
Oh, really?
And even a lot of the figure paintings as well, yeah.
It's a lot easier to do a profile.
Yeah, I would say you stand a greater chance of success because you're only having to model half of the face and sometimes half of each feature. It's more, it just demands more that you really pay attention to that contour. There's sometimes less information there, and that means that it has to be more accurate. But again, if you're closer, you have a better chance at getting the correct accuracy. Going back in and reinforcing that chroma and value in that little shadow there. Now, if you lock into the correct value and also the intense chroma, when somebody looks at a small version of it, it'll just look like an ambiguous dark like it does in real life, but it won't look flat. It'll look more glowy. And then when you look close at the painting, you'll notice that there's a lot more chroma there than you even realized. But it's definitely one of those things that if you haven't been told about it, you won't know to look for it. I'm finding for that area it was actually a lot lighter than I thought it needed to be, and so I'm needing to find a value that's in between my top bar and um, my lower bar of colors. So I've bridged the gap between the two values. If you'll notice, my first attempt, what I had done was taken that dark puddle on the top and added white to it. I laid down a stroke. It was a better value, but it wasn't the correct chroma. So then I went down to my lower strings, which were my top right group of red, yellow, and blue on the left, and my lower left group of red, yellow, and blue on the right, and I merged those together. That gave me a higher chroma at the value that I needed it to be. And that's a perfect example of why you should not just take a dark paint and try to lighten it with white, but you should try to stick to the red, yellow, and blue that are closer to the value that you need them to be.
Are you measuring?
Yes. See my brush hover there at an angle? You know, I think I do actually pull out binoculars for this painting. I'm not sure if I have them out yet, but I'm pretty sure I do end up using them. So we're probably going to see some of them, some slower brush strokes happening a little later on. I'm trying to think at this point about the forms of the cartilages as well as I build up the color here. And that lower lateral cartilage certainly has more of a ball shape. So I'm trying to get some of the strokes here, both up and down and left and right, to kind of follow very subtly the curvature of that ball, so that even without identifying color or value, you can just sort of see the strokes to suggest that anatomy. This is one of the most subtle parts of the nose that you have to describe as it flows from that lower lateral over to the wing. You know, it's a fine balance between over modeling it and having it just be too flat of a light shape as it transitions over. And if we were painting this as a more direct or looser alla prima painting, it's something that we might not even make that distinction over. You know, it's something that's such low profile that if we did describe a difference, it would only come after a significant buildup of some of the other areas of the painting.
Oh my gosh.
I just lost the yellow ochre. It's the dangers of the parallel palette there.
It looks like it definitely fell on. Oh, there it is.
Wow.
You saved it.
Yeah, I don't even think it hit my palette on the way down. I think
No.
it just went straight to the easel. That can be the danger of using some of the more buttery paints like Rembrandt and Gamblin. You know, they are going to be more inclined to fall. Whereas if we use something more like Vasari or Old Holland or Rublev, they're going to be much more likely to stay put. Although the danger with some of those stiffer ones, I've noticed like with the Rublev ones, is because it is so stiff, sometimes you have to hit the pile really hard with your brush to dig into it, and then you might accidentally fling it off when you do that, and I've done that before.
I think paint has fallen every single time. At least
You
a
mean
little
every
bit.
video?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I will gladly accept falling paint in order to have a vertical palette like this.
So the lighting conditions the same.
Yeah.
Mhm.
I want to be able to be really close in understanding what the color is on my palette to what it's going to be on the painting.
It must be hard to use those palettes that people hold.
I have found it difficult for certain types of painting. So for example, something like this where I'm trying to actually mix all of these tiny little increments with a larger palette like this with big puddles is not too hard. But if I'm going with a more impressionistic style painting where I'm trying to just mix two colors in white and keep everything higher key, higher chroma, and constantly clean off my palette, those do not work very well because you have to be able to be holding paintbrushes the whole time you do that. Or not paintbrushes, I'm sorry, paper towels. So you can always be cleaning your brushes off. And so it's really hard to hold the palette and excess brushes and paper towels all in one hand. I tried to do that before, and it's quite a bit more challenging. But the arm palette does work well for me, I think, when I'm working with a relatively similar local color and just doing little micro shifts, and also using more pure paint or maybe paint with just the smallest amount of oil in it, so that everything stays a little stiff and doesn't fly around. You certainly can't have wet paint with a lot of medium using the arm palette because it's just a slip and slide and you fling paint everywhere. But certainly on some of my larger paintings especially, I'll often go in and zero in on an area with an arm palette so that I can actually hold it up close to where I'm painting and really get up in there, and get some tiny little micro shifts. But generally I just find it to be a little more cumbersome than anything else. And I do know some artists who've developed really bad sciatica pain because they've been using a palette like that, either holding it or even just having it down on the table and leaning over to mix their color. That actually develops a lot of bad back problems. Whereas the vertical palette, or even an arm palette where you're holding it up, isn't going to create as many problems. But I do know some artists who've run into other back issues from holding the arm palette too. So there's I think a greater health risk in the arm palette, despite its more classical origin.
Yeah.
But the pro side of it, of course, is that you can step back. And I think that is the challenge that most students have, is that they don't get back far enough from their painting enough. And I resolved that early on by setting my palette back about 10 feet away from my canvas and then forcing myself to mix back there for 6 months or a year.
Before you made a brush stroke.
Before getting close to the canvas and putting my palette up next to it.
But that is the kind of traditional thing? Is that what the old masters would use as the...
What, the arm palette?
Yeah.
Yep, the arm palette. I mean, they didn't have glass palettes back then. I don't think they really thought about a contraption to set up a vertical palette. There were some clever devices I've seen. I've seen Repin in a photograph where he has sort of an arm palette that's been modified to strap to his waist, so that it's sort of like a table right in front of him that's slightly angled up, so that he can just have it and mix and walk forward and back. That's a clever. Maybe we should bring that back.
Nobody thought of like a table, though?
Oh, lots of people put it on tables.
Okay.
Yeah. I think Whistler had a 24 by 36 table that he mixed on.
Wow.
But also back then, you weren't expected to live as long as we live now, so you didn't have to worry about those onsets of problems later on.
Yeah, back problems at 50, doesn't matter if you're dead by 40.
Yeah. Totally different way to live life if you don't expect to live as long. Now we've lived so long that we know what's coming if we live long enough, and so we have to lead a slightly different lifestyle now than we would have if we weren't used to it.
How long would people be in the academy for back then?
I think it was anywhere between 4 to 10 years.
That's a huge chunk of their life.
Oh yeah, for sure. And part of it, I think it's probably 4 to 6 years of actual at the academy, and then a few years in Rome if they made the Prix de Rome. So it translated to, roughly a decade of studying under a master.
and then a little more time before they died of like lead poisoning or
Yeah.
something.
Well, you start when you're 20, and so you've got, a good 10 to 20 years of painting before you die.
Oh my goodness.
Although, back in at least the later times of the academy, they were living a longer life, 80 years old. So they had a good run. A little bit of edge softening here so I can zero in on some more detail. It's kind of a nice base coat where I'll be able to get in with a little tiny pointed brush and create some of those hatch marks that suggest more of the texture of the skin. Yeah, I do find it interesting now with people saying how little time they have, and that was one of the appeals, I think, of people joining the academy when we were at the Scottsdale Artist School, was that it was only 2 years long. And even though we told people it's 2 years if you put in a lot of hard work and outside class work, most people just hear it's 2 years and then you're good to go. You've had all the lessons that you can have, and then you don't need to go to class anymore. And so those are sort of two really different ideas. And when even looking at a 2 to 4 year school, or even maybe a 6 years master's program in art, that's still just scratching the surface of a traditional art school. But I mean, you look at the quality of the work that they ultimately sort of built up to when they were working full time for 4 to 6 to 10 years, and it's very different than the quality of work put out now in just a few years, and obviously, and it should be. But we should at least recognize the fact that there's a direct correlation between amount of practice and time in school and the skill sets of artists of the past. Flattened out that shadow shape so I could really see the structure of some of those lights before digging into more specific shadows. Shadows are difficult to see color in sometimes because they're just so dark, and this would be a case where you'd really want to isolate with a dark isolator, a card that's painted black, that you can really see the color against.
So do you always isolate a dark color with a dark isolator, or do you kind of try to run the gamut and see?
I would try to always match the value of what I'm seeing with an appropriate isolator. Ideally it'd be great to have a whole value scale of isolators, 1 through 10 or whatever you can get, so that you can really sort of key right into what it is. You just have to remember that just because you're using a value 3 isolator doesn't necessarily mean you'll be painting at a value 3 in a situation like this where the lighting condition on the model is so different from that which is on your painting. But the closer you can get the isolator to be in value to the color you're trying to isolate, the more clearly you'll be able to see the color without the influence of values. So that would be the ultimate goal. For years I had just 3 values. I had a card. I ordered postcards that had the sort of lamination on them, or the shininess that postcards have, and it was one that I made myself and just had printed at one of those print shops, and it was half black and a half mid-gray, and then on the back it was completely white, and so I could isolate off of white, black, or a mid-value. So that was adaptable to a large variety of situations. But I did that for years using the actual card, especially, not necessarily for every single brush stroke, but whenever I was keying into a new area, like keying into the shadows here, I would isolate to see what the actual value should be. Keying into the big broad planes of the light, I would isolate each of those.
Okay. That's interesting. I was just about to ask how much you isolated. So it would just be like any big area that has changed?
Yeah. Because ultimately you have to be able to develop your eye and your ability to isolate on your own and sort of key it to an area. It's the same sort of idea that we've talked about before, where you have to do a lot of sketching, like the Croquis Cafe sketching, so that you can develop the ability, your visual ability to take angles and comparative measurement, because doing the physical measurements will only take you so far, especially a situation like this when I'm 15 feet away. I can do comparative measurement all I want, but it is just not going to be precise enough to get some of the finer shapes in here. I have to rely on my eye and my ability to sort of comparatively lock everything together. And the same is going to have to be true with color. You can isolate until the cows come home, but eventually you won't be able to isolate a shape small enough to really clearly mix it. And so you just have to learn to key into a large area and then modulate it until you get it, the shifting to where you want it to be. And then just keep checking that overall area to make sure that these tiny little pieces you've laid in haven't shifted the overall quality of the color. Now you can do little tricks to help boost your skill set in this area, or at least guide your observation. For example, if you're working from photographs, like a lot of the photographs we have here for reference, you can continually zoom into those photographs on your computer until all you see in one area, just one pixel blown up huge, is one piece of color. And so that's essentially taking one little speck and then isolating it really easily, filling up your computer monitor and being able to mix that really clearly. And so you can key into an area right away if you're using a computer. And hopefully as you do that, you sort of are perceptive to what you're perceiving colors at when you're observing the whole image versus what you're perceiving color at when you're zeroing in, because we typically lean, red or yellow or blue or green in our own personal tendencies. And so you want to make sure you lock into those and adjust them. So when you're working from life, you're a little more aware, like, oh, I remember when I worked from the photo, I thought this was red, but when I zoomed in, it was really more of a golden yellow, so I need to make sure I paint it that way. And again, it's just helping guide your understanding. Now, this photo reference is certainly not as good as most of the other photo references we have, so it'll be a little more difficult to do that with, but you can definitely key it that way if you're working off of the computer monitor. Just one word of caution, if you are working from a computer monitor, you need to adjust the brightness of your computer monitor so that white is the same value of the white of your canvas before it's toned. So that just makes it that you can literally match colors and values off of your monitor without having to sort of figure out this translation. I usually do that to my computers before I start working off of a photo reference, if I have a photo reference, because it's just going to simplify the whole process. There's no need for me to try and turn my computer on maximum brightness and be blinded by it and then figure out how to set my value structure to that when I could never mimic those effects of light emanating from a board or from a computer. And so I'll just lower the volume of brightness on my computer until white matches the white of my canvas, and then I know that the other colors should be theoretically able to be mixed directly off of my palette. Then you just zoom in when you need to key into a color area. And then once you key into that area, you zoom back out and try to create all the transitions in the area.
Is that something you figured out on your own? Because that's not something you're going to find in like an old book. Like Solomon J. Solomon's not going to say, turn down the brightness on your laptop.
Right. Yeah, no, it is something I figured out on my own just after a lot of experience and a lot of trial and error and failure, and then seeing other people work from monitors and just sort of picking up on it. Mm-hmm. It was essentially came down to me trying to figure out how to get the monitor to look like a printed reference, even though it's not a printed reference, because I did notice early on, especially when I was getting a lot of magazines by artists, I would look at an image on the computer and it would look so glowy and so intense and so bright, and then I would look at it in print and it looked more possible to actually achieve those mixtures than it did on the computer. And so early on I made this connection that images look different when they're reflecting light off of something like paper or canvas than they do when they're projecting light like out of a monitor. And so I realized that adjusting those values of the brightness of the monitor had a huge impact on me being able to just mix exactly what I was observing. Also, switching computers, actually, believe it or not, helped me see color a little better. We've edited all of these videos off of iMacs, and I noticed that there were quite a few artists who I admired who were painting from photo references from an iMac because the colors were so clean, the brightness could be adjusted so easily, simple editing could be done relatively easily, and it just produced a higher resolution and clarity and color quality than other monitors I've worked from. And so switching over made working from photos on a computer much easier.
You can find like more expensive, higher quality monitors for PC also, but I think that's pretty standard for like a Mac to just have them.
Yeah. I mean, what I realized is that I could buy a refurbished Mac that would have an amazing screen on it for a fraction of the cost of buying a good PC monitor that had the same amount of color. And every Mac that I've seen, as far as the iMacs go, has had consistent quality with the monitor, whereas the high quality PC monitor is a more specific niche, and I'd have to really talk to a variety of people before I settled on dishing out that kind of money for one.
Yeah.
But even some of the nicer quality PC ones I've seen, and this is an example of why I didn't go that way, have been just too colorful, really, and a little less natural.
Mm-hmm.
So it makes certain things like movies and games look intense and really, striking, but they weren't necessarily naturalistic enough for painting off of. Whereas I realized that the Macs were. And so I actually was working off of a large monitor, like a 40-inch monitor, for quite a long time, so that I could easily sight size any photo reference onto my canvas, and that was fantastic. But ultimately, as my ability to draw grew, and I recognized the need to mix finer colors, I realized that I would be happier with a smaller monitor of higher clarity and color quality than a larger monitor of lower color quality.
The blue on the palette looks so intense. I saw the dark colors.
The King's Blue there? Yeah. And that's interesting because it's a pretty low chroma color compared to a lot of the other colors on there, just because it has so much white in it. That's a very abrupt transition that I have to make from light to dark on the ball of the nose there. That still has to appear relatively smooth for it to appear round, but it has to take place over a very short amount of time.
It's tricky.
Yeah. Again, it helps with that larger puddle to be able to mix those subtle transitions.
Are you painting up to the line there that you used to block in?
Yeah. And it's at this point where I'll decide if I need to completely cover it or not cover it, depending on the contours of the form.
Would you be able to erase the line out if you needed to, since it's all wet wash? Okay.
Yep, I could dig into that with some mineral spirits and a stiff brush if I need to. Spiking that chroma right at the transition is pretty important right there. Otherwise, your nose won't have that sort of glow that makes it look both soft and hard. It'll just look like a flat shelf. I'm opting, for the most part, to go with a broken edge on that transition from light to dark to avoid mixing the chroma also. So as I lay this in, I vary that edge.
That transition in the photo looks pretty sharp.
You mean between the light and the dark?
Yeah.
Yeah, so sharp that it actually looks flat and a little awkward.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And again, the photo is putting it in context to the whole rest of the environment, not just the face. So it is actually making it harder relative to some of the other things that are there. So at a glance, it doesn't necessarily look too bad. But the more you look at it, the more it looks like a strange, awkward shape painted on the model. I'm laying in that dark accent there, which probably won't stay, but I realize that it needs to have quite a bit of chroma in there, and it needs to stay in the red family, so I'm just boosting it more with straight reds as I modulate the value there and create that transition from the dark towards the lighter areas on top. Remember, if a color is looking too flat or too dead or too lacking in chroma, all you need to do is lean it more towards one color family. So just identify what color family it needs to be and then start modulating your color mixture to have more dominant influence of, in this case, red. We're getting to that stage here now, which is similar to that stage in the last video of the eye, where I can start to slow down pretty soon here and really go nice and steady with developing everything out. You know, I'm not in any rush now. We're only halfway through the session, a little over halfway through the session. I've really pretty much figured out a lot of that which makes the nose. And so I get to go a little more steady and a little slower from here, try to get more nuanced edges and then build up those highlights to be really sculptural.
It's a nice cool blue.
Yeah. It's actually really low chroma too. So low chroma that in isolation you might not even consider it a blue. It would look like a gray.
Why is that dark lower in chroma?
The dark that I just laid down?
Yeah.
That's just how it happened to be. It's not getting as much direct light. The fill light of the room is a white light. Mm-hmm. So we're getting more of a mixture of light coming in there as opposed to the super intense chromatic incandescent that's on her. So it actually, in this case, except for instances of reflected light, expect the shadows to be probably a little lower in chroma, pick up a little more grays and greens and blues than the intense yellow of the flesh tone. So this is something that we would see commonly in older paintings also. We see those gray-greens at some of the transitions and halftones. The only difference is in what separates this from a really traditional sort of color structure is that the light is so intense. It's an intense spotlight, which did not exist hundreds of years ago. Mm-hmm. And as a result, we're getting a ton of reflected light. Like you can see on in the reference photo, the jaw of the model and even the underside of the nose is getting so much reflected light from where the light is hitting her chest and shoulders and bouncing right back up into her shadow area that they're leaning really heavily on the warm side, whereas traditionally we'd have softer lights and possibly even candlelight, which would not have a strong enough impact to bounce all the way over to the walls or surrounding area and reflect back in. So we see more of a traditional low chroma gray or blue-green at those transitions.
Okay.
And that's usually the grisaille underpainting sparkling through in a classical painting.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
And that would be a perfect example, that shadow under the nose, where I would be mostly just leaving grisaille showing through. And that's the color that a grisaille would be.
Mm-hmm. So it's not a rule that darks have to be chromatic necessarily?
No, no. There's almost no rules because there's infinite variations of light combinations and modeled forms that can create reflections. So we just have to be very observant to everything.
There's no rules, just observation.
Yeah, no rules, just observation. That's probably the last thing people want to hear when they're learning how to paint.
Look better.
Yeah, paint it better. Yeah. See it better, paint it better. Getting some of those little hatch marks with slightly transparent paint to let some of the undertones show through. That's what really gives flesh tones its luminosity, is when you allow some of those underlayers to show through. And I'm doing that just with a soft pointed brush and allowing the strokes to not completely cover it up. It's just these little hatch marks. So we see just a little bit extra variation in there. There I went in with that brush and the mineral spirits to carve that line away.
How are you doing that without getting rid of the toning? Are you just being really light?
Yeah, I usually start with light pressure and then work harder and harder in. If this had been toned today, it would have been much harder to do. But
Okay.
because it's had some time to sit, I've got a little more flexibility with it. So notice I laid my white out sort of in a huge string that encompasses what all of the red, yellow, and blues on the top left would be. This is something I've heard other artists tell you to do. Instead of just doing a small puddle of white, making a long string of white so that you can attack it from different sides and be able to dip into pure white when you need to that's not diluted with other colors. Before I was doing that, I would have to continually take my palette knife and scrape off the top of the white to ensure I was dipping into white instead of polluted white. Our model Sarah here has a pretty pronounced lower lateral septum, a really strong ball of the nose. Difficult to identify in that reference photo where it gets diffused into the cheek, but she does have that pretty pronounced ball, and so I'm going in and adding that right now. Now I'm bridging the two lower lateral cartilages. There's the tiniest indentation between the two, which I think is still suggested here, but it was a little too strong, and so I just bridged the gap between the two lower laterals. If we had to pinpoint some quote-unquote rules and describe them, it actually would be a good idea to do that because it would probably diffuse some misunderstandings that a lot of students have and be better suited to know when they can apply some of those rules and when they have to toss them out the window. We can start with the idea of the generic flesh tone of, say, a Caucasian person. And if we look at something like the Munsell system, which describes or codifies color in terms of hue, value, and chroma, where hue is the color family. In this case, flesh tone, we would say something like YR or sometimes RY, yellow-red or red-yellow, depending on the person. And then value on a scale of 1 to 9, we would say the flesh tone in the lights is something like a 7-ish, 7-ish to 8-ish. And then we'd say chroma. I think the Munsell system uses something like a 16-point system to describe chroma, 16 being the most intense, 0 or 1, I can't recall, being the least intense. We have something like 5 to 8 or something describing human flesh tone. So it's really typically a lower chroma color. The value is not as light as we would think it would be for the lights, and it is dealing with a family value anywhere from yellow to red. And so that is just sort of a broad stroke describing what color should look like. You know, if we look at the eye on the top right, that still falls into that system. It's just a slightly lower chroma, describing more natural light. What we have here is an incandescent strong light, which describes a higher chroma, but we're still not using CAD red or CAD yellow straight out of the tube, so it is a little bit more controlled. So that describes the generic flesh tone. As far as other points that might be a little bit more generic, we have, of course, the color family, or the color temperature rule, which says a cool light produces warm shadows, a warm light produces cool shadows. We know, in fact, that a cool light or warm light doesn't really have any influence on the actual color of the shadows. It just has an influence on how we perceive the color of the shadows. This painting is a great example where I have a pretty neutral kind of gray underneath the nose, and it looks cool and purple because of how warm the flesh tone is. So it might not be literally true, but it's certainly sort of conceptually true, how we observe things. You know, if we have a cooler light, such as in the example of the eye on top there, we had a cool north light, which we can see in sort of the whites of the eyes are a little bit more bluish, and the flesh tones are a little bit more pinkish compared to the shadows and halftones, which are a little more reddish golden color. So that system holds true, certainly, even if we're not painting it literally that way. Now, a lot of artists will tell you that the turning of form between light and dark tends to spike in chroma. Sometimes that's true. It certainly helps facilitate the turning of form in a lot of instances. If we look in this case at the difference between the wing of the nostril and the area right underneath it, the shadow, where we get that spike in chroma as the form turns. So that's can be a common sort of thing. So we can look for some of those instances to help us describe some of the generic rules of color. Other than that, I don't know if I would put too much heavy influence on anything else. You know, as far as generic color flesh tone mixtures, they're relatively unimportant. All the time when I list something, say on social media, you know, do a posting of a painting and people comment on how beautiful the flesh tones are, they ask me what are the colors I used in them, and I typically have no idea. Sometimes it's a limited palette, sometimes it's an expanded palette, but honestly what it comes down to is that the palette that I selected was only selected, if I did actually consciously think about the colors, were only selected to reflect the colors that I was observing up on the model. And so it doesn't have anything to do with the colors, it just has to do with the lighting conditions that I put on the model that created those colors. That's the more important thing, because you can use 100 different colors to make sort of the same flesh tone colors. It's up to you. You know, at this point it's really a matter of convenience as far as which colors we would like to use. As far as there's some rules that artists will say about shadows needing to be more transparent, lights needing to be more solid. That's actually a rule that goes back several hundred years. You know, we see that in writings as far back as the times of, you know, Rubens and Titian. But it is sort of a stylistic option. It will create more structure in your lights and make things look more three-dimensional and help your shadows recede quite a bit more, but it's not imperative to make your painting look accurate. I think it goes beyond the scope of shape, value, and edge. It goes into paint application, which is, again, the more advanced concept to consider, and it can heighten the realism of your work, but it's not necessary for its correctness, so to speak. So that is just something to consider there. I think ultimately really good, accurate, skillful painting comes down to a combination of a strong knowledge base, so how we understand light striking a form and the ratio of influence, you know, higher proportional influence on planes directly facing the light over both value and color, and then sort of an even or compromising influence at the halftones, and then a more local color influence on the shadow side. Combined with our observation of what colors we are seeing, and then combined with concepts like opacity versus transparency. These are all things that come together to make a good painting. It's never one rule in isolation. I'm going to lay in this highlight now, and I'm wanting to maintain a really high chroma at this light value, and it's going to be kind of tricky because I have such high chroma around that highlight that once I start to dip into values this high, it's just naturally going to look less chromatic because I'm using so much white. So I'm going to have to utilize a different sort of little trick technique here, which I've seen some artists do, which is to lean just really, really heavily on one color family and then just dump a ton of white in that color family, and then potentially go to another color family and dump a ton of white in that. And instead of having just a generic orange, I might have a splice of really high value yellow and a splice of really high value red right next to each other to create a little bit of broken color. So from a distance, it may be observed to be more of an orange, but up close, it might be a variety of different colors. So this is a technique that some artists will use to spike the chroma at a highlight. So you'll see some of that in the final here. But it does get knocked down a little bit to the surrounding values. I don't necessarily blow out that highlight to be super white, definitely not as white as it's getting laid in now. It will get keyed down just a little bit.
That's something I think looks really good, the broken color and highlight.
Yeah. Well, if you think about, too, a highlight typically describes almost one little plane as it faces the light too. So if it's a big highlight, breaking it up like that tends to feel a little more natural. You can get a little more color in there, a little more structure.
So is that something you can only really get away with or make sense of if it's a bigger highlight? So if it's like a small little point, there's no reason to do it.
Yeah, well, I mean, you could try. It probably wouldn't look very good. And I think it certainly works better with flesh tone, which has skin being pulled around something, so it has that effect already. It is something. It looks good, I think, because that is to some degree how we're observing it. Whereas if we were to just lay a big piece of highlight on the tip of that nose that wasn't broken up, that's not really how highlights tend to look if we look really close, because we have all the pores and everything sort of breaking up that highlight. Whereas the reverse would be true. If we were painting like a metal ball, for example, and we did a broken highlight like this, it wouldn't really make much sense. It wouldn't reflect the textural quality of the ball. So I think one of the reasons that does look successful on a portrait is because, to some degree at least, that is how the texture of the skin is. So we have to consider it. It's one of those things that we don't want to just throw in for stylistic sake, and that tends to happen. We see somebody do something like this and say, oh, well, that looks good when highlights are done this way, and so everything they paint has highlights like that, and it doesn't always necessarily translate well. Tricks like this look good because the trick is founded on observation, unfortunately, and so again, it comes right back full circle there. And you just have to remember that for every trick, there is a context that it has to be done in to be most successful. A highlight like this wouldn't look good on the previous painting we did, because the previous painting we did doesn't create a structure or set of highlights that look like this. And so it has to be taken on a case-by-case basis. And this whole idea of observation trumping little tricks is probably why I've been able to advance a little faster in my technical capacity as a painter, because I'm not relying on many of these tricks, if any, when I'm painting. I'm just trying to do something that looks like what I see. And so a lot of times it's like, oh, well, this kind of looks like how it is, so let me see if I can do it like that, even though that's counterintuitive to what I might be thinking. And even if it may be a little awkward at first, that has always paid out in the long run, because I've learned more because of it. And because it departs from my normal scope of how I do things, I'm more inclined to remember it. So if I'm ever confronted with a situation where this happened again, I can say, wait a minute, I've seen this before and I did something really different and it came out pretty cool, so let me try it again. And just being more open to those changes sort of advances your scope of knowledge in painting.
Interesting. So you were really just trying to paint what you see?
Yeah, not really much more than that.
Uh-huh.
I mean, I've encountered situations like this before where I've done this to some degree,
Okay.
but every situation ends up being a little bit different. So I don't think there's any painting I've ever done that's been painted the same way as another painting.
Mhm.
Even if I've tried to do that, my sort of observational tendencies always override a little bit. And so I'm never painting something quite exactly the same, even though they may have a very similar feel to it.
Mhm.
You know, it's also really helps in doing master copies also. Working like this helps when I'm doing a master copy, because then I'll see paint application that's similar to how I painted it when I observed something in a different way, and then I can sort of put two and two together and realize, oh, okay, well, this artist had a tendency to do this in these situations quite frequently. And then because of that, I can connect it to more examples within their work of where it can be applied, and thus that technique has now a greater scope,
Oh, interesting.
greater usage. And kind of think of all of these little tidbits as this kind of vast web that weaves the technical side of painting. And we have to kind of remember each of these little scenarios and piece it all together to really take full advantage of them. And to do that most successfully, I think, for most people, and it certainly is for me, it works better if you tie it together conceptually instead of factually. So to clarify, we are much better at recalling bits of information that are tied to concepts that we already know, that are interwoven into how things work, as opposed to recalling specific facts or dates or names. You know, there's sometimes I can't even remember the name of an artist, but I can remember how they painted something because I can tie that method into things that I already know. So as you think about painting, instead of thinking of it as, okay, what was the formula of color that this person used for this, you think of the concept of it and then you relate it to, you know, what they've done, and then you can more fully understand things, and then actually be able to recall and use that instead of trying to always refer to notebooks and formulas.
Okay.
Got my really, really tiny rosemary brush now. This is, again, probably one of my favorite parts of a painting, at least this type of painting. Just little tiny massages to get that edge quality where I need it to be. All of the colors are pretty set in there to where I want them. But this is just kind of going back to the macro after I've done a little micro work.
Is it Rembrandt who does that?
Does
the
what,
highlights?
yeah, build things up like this. Yeah. Again, his technique would be slightly different, but there are some commonalities. The superficial quality of it's pretty similar, but the way he would work would be kind of what most people consider overworking. So he's working to the point where the paint gets really tacky and tough, to where most people would really struggle with it, and then he gets really forceful and is pushing and dragging with it, so that things don't really blend, but they kind of goop into each other, so to speak, and then that's layered up, and you can get a lot of interesting textural qualities with it, and it really starts to catch the light nicely. But again, he only did that in, you know, a handful or some of his paints, not all of his paints. You know, I've seen Rembrandts that are painted so loose that it looks like they could have been done in a couple hours, and some that look so refined and smooth and polished that they look like a photo printed onto a canvas. And then, you know, everywhere in between. So, you know, he was certainly an artist who didn't constrict himself to the common techniques of the time. He definitely wasn't considered part of the classical or academic world, either in his subject matter or his technical execution. But what he did, you know, certainly paved the way years later for other artists to explore different techniques and incorporate them into a more classical style. There's a lot of attention paid to that transition between the light and the dark, even at this stage as I'm starting to splice color in, because it's so paramount into understanding the cartilages and how the shape of the nose is made. Especially at this distance too, you know, I really can't see too much of all of those angles. It's really going to require some base knowledge of the um, of how all those cartilages turn around the nostril. It's important to lock into that stroke that I just made there. That describes that transition between the side plane and the cheek. You know, we mentioned it a little bit on the last video, but that's a transition that's usually made a little too abruptly with too high of a value contrast, and so it doesn't describe how that skin that's there gently transitions into the cheek, because it's not an abrupt transition. You know, we have that little bit of skin, and you can feel it on the side of your nose as it goes back to the cheek, and it's really at an angled plane. It's not, you don't have an abrupt cut back to the cheek and then a side plane of the cheek. There is that subtle transition, and you have to tap into that little value contrast. And it can be especially hard because when you look at the model, especially like our reference photo here, it looks like a really hard line between the shadow side of the nose and the cheek. And so it can be misinterpreted um, that form takes a really abrupt change there, when really it is quite a bit more gentle than that. One of those somewhat generic rules that we can consider and at least apply into this situation is, and we've mentioned it before, this is a harsh light situation with a very chromatic, in this case yellow light, and any harsh light situation is going to produce harder edges, especially at those cast shadows or where we have occlusions. Um, so we can see that especially in the cast shadow alongside of the nose there. Really, really hard edges, coupled with the lighter values and the intense chroma, that's what creates the illusion of this light source on the model, in contrast to our natural light above, which creates softer edges, lower chroma overall. So those are some generic rules that you can look for. Certainly, I wouldn't encourage over describing them past what you observe, but again, use them as guidelines for observations. If you know that there's a harsh light on the model, look for opportunities to exploit those hard edges and some of those higher chromas. This wing is tricky because, again, it's a situation where it needs to be a pretty fast turning of the form without much distance to exploit it. Otherwise, that nostril will look too flat overall. And it's just going to require careful observation in there and really hitting those transitions little bit by little bit. And I do that with these almost tiny little hatch marks that I'm laying in. both from the light side to the dark side and from the left side of the wing to the right side, where it hits that occlusion. The sort of slickness or juiciness of the paint right now is actually a function of the micro hard edges that are happening in there. The fact that the paint has not been smoothed out like it was in the top one, top painting, but in fact every stroke, if you look closely, has its own individual characteristic. You can actually see kind of clearly all of the edges around it, and it's those sort of tiny little hard edges of one color next to another color next to another color that creates that look that we identify with as juicy, because it makes these sort of micro shines in there. Whereas I could immediately kill the juicy look right away by just taking a soft brush and knocking it all down. It's those kind of little subtle cues that we don't think about that give the viewer an indication that this is oil paint and this is shiny, juicy paint. If you're working at home and at any point you find that your values are starting to migrate more towards a mid value, which is super, super common, especially if you're working on a mixing surface that's this size, just remember, scrape that paint off. Keep your values clear. If you find that you're bouncing all over with your value structure, or it's just not clearly identifiable which is light and which is dark, that is your opportunity to scrape that palette down and then start with some new mixtures.
Would you be able to get away with having the same sort of paint quality on the eye, for instance?
I would. It would just have a different feel to it. And unfortunately, it wouldn't look as natural to a natural light situation. It would look kind of oily um, instead of that little bit of atmospheric quality. So it would kind of betray the lighting condition. Certainly, it would look fine. It wouldn't be necessarily wrong, but it just wouldn't appear as natural.
Okay, I see. Yeah, it does seem like natural lighting paintings generally are smoother.
Yeah, just more subtle transition of value or color. Typically softer edges, whether or not it's actually made by softening the edge or just breaking up the edge quality. You know, when we look at the video of the mouth coming up, we'll see how some of the edges are handled there where they're just broken to create some of the softness. It keeps the painting a little looser, but still keeps it soft and subtle. So it's sort of a way around the over blending that we did in the eye video. Even as I relay that crease down, I make special consideration that the top of it needs to be softer and a little more broken. The bottom needs to be a little bit harder. That's where we're seeing two independent forms, a light form that's turned so quickly that we just see a harder dark form behind it. So it produces a sharper edge quality on the bottom side of the dark shade. I'm trying to replace some of the darker values on that side plane with higher chroma. I've been doing that ever since it was first blocked in. Um, Raising that value and replacing it with a color change to preserve the value and avoid getting too dark and heavy on that side plane. You know, when we compare on the model, since we have a shot of the whole head here, if we compare that side plane to some of the other areas, it's certainly not anywhere near the darkness of some of the darks on there. So it does need to fall in sort of the realm of light, but it still has to look like a side plane where it gets darker. And so we can lift that up and adjust some of the color and chroma to compensate and help turn that form.
You're taking some out. You're not just going over it?
No, I'm going over it. Yeah.
Okay.
I'm just building on top of it. I mean, it still falls in that realm of light and halftone, so in this case, I'm going to be more inclined to build on top of it instead of get it thinner. You know, the underside, the nose, and the cast shadow under the nose, even though we've painted on top of them, they still actually are retaining a little more transparency than some of these lights. And again, I'm intentionally doing that to help create more dimensionality and more form here, just keeping those darks a little more transparent. But this half tone on the side of the nose does fall within the realm of the light, even though it is slightly darker than the lights around it. And so I'm going to just lay more paint on top instead of digging down into the paint. I might as well note that when I was learning to paint and doing stuff kind of like this, you know, painting just a couple eyes on a canvas, I didn't do it this way with the tone background. I think at that point I hadn't even done any drawings on tone paper with charcoal and white chalk. And I was thinking much more of the overall aesthetic of the painting as well. So even if I got just an eye or two eyes on there, I would have these sort of looser kind of bravado strokes around it to have it look like that eye is sort of emerging from that background and have a nice sort of abstract design quality around the feature. And that made it sort of a self-contained painting. Even though it was just a feature and a study of a feature, it made it this really pretty, aesthetically beautiful painting that could be hung up, as opposed to kind of like what I'm doing here. You know, each quadrant of this canvas is neatly and artificially divided into 4 parts, and you know, there's no real bravado flair to them. You know, they're really just careful and studied. This is not a painting that I might consider selling. Although for the first 5 or 6 years of me learning how to paint, that is how I painted. You know, I would paint every painting as though it was headed for a gallery, and you know, not just in the quality that I was trying to do it, but also with the design elements and the abstraction. And so even if you're having to buckle down and learn how to do these features, it shouldn't necessarily be something that's painful and labored and something you're never going to do anything with this painting again, and so you don't really care about it, treat this as an aesthetically beautiful painting that you are going to use or hopefully even sell. If you design it well enough, you can certainly sell a painting of just a couple eyes or even a cool looking nose. It's all in how you sell it, sell the idea. And if you start now practicing that, then you'll not only get an advantage of learning how to paint these things better, but also learning how to just make better paintings in general.
Is there a way to practice those? I don't want to call them like additional elements, but like the flair that can sell a paint. Yeah.
Well, yeah, you can do abstract paintings on the side, which I'd already done before, but largely too, it's looking at other artists who have done it. Richard Schmid is a great example. You can even look historically. Velázquez has some unfinished paintings that look pretty cool, but you just have to hunt and find them. Any unfinished work will give you sort of an understanding into the thought process of an artist. You can even look at some of the Bouguereau heads, the alla prima heads that he would do as studies for his paintings. And they weren't just cropped into a terrible formal cropping. There was a design element to them, even though he was an indirect painter for the most part. His studies looked aesthetically beautiful and could be framed and hung up on any wall.
Yeah.
And so there's certainly something to be said for that. You're never just practicing. You're always crafting this beautiful thing, and you want to give it all that attention. And just look at all these examples of unfinished works by artists to get a little glimpse of their understanding and their aesthetic taste, and hopefully you can start to adopt some of it in your own.
It was pretty incredible to see some of Bouguereau's alla primas.
Yeah.
That was surprising. I thought he was I thought it'd take him forever to do it.
Yeah, I definitely had that misconception when I started too. And I felt like, I don't know if I'll ever be able to paint like Bouguereau because he spends so long on a painting, and I don't know if I can spend that long on a painting. But just because he spent a long time on a painting doesn't mean he spent, he did it over hundreds of layers, which was kind of the misconception that I had. It was just that they were big and a lot of complex elements, and he was doing a lot of studies off to the side. And some of the stuff he could paint pretty directly, some of the stuff he layered, but only if there was an intentional need to layer it. But now that I know more and I've seen his paintings, I look at his work and I think, what an incredibly fast painter this guy was to be able to do stuff and even build it up to that level of quality. I don't want anyone to associate, and I've told this to some students, I don't want anyone to associate this idea that a higher level of rendering necessarily demands a ton of additional time. It just demands better sight, being able to see more clearly and thus make better choices. But just because there's more there doesn't necessarily mean it should take you huge more amounts of time. If you understand that, then it sort of frees you up from another excuse. I'm all about finding reasons to ditch the excuses, because then if you can realize when you're using an excuse to excuse yourself, obviously from your approach, then you can thus focus on figuring out how the old masters came up with a solution for it, and then make yourself a better painter instead of just dismissing it. The talent excuse, you can get rid of that one right away. The all of these they had more time to paint excuse, and you can dismiss that. I don't know. I've even heard people say, well, they were just better back then. That's just such a broad general excuse that you're not even trying at that point.
Do you think that anybody can paint or draw?
Yes. Yeah. The level to which they advance, though, is entirely up to them. So I guess, obviously anybody can draw or paint. It's just to what skill level are you asking? I think anyone can learn to craft a picture that looks decent enough to sell in a gallery. Whether or not they're going to go beyond that and become a truly great painter and maybe be able to paint in all these different styles or situations is totally independent on the person, but the set of concepts we have is fairly straightforward enough that if anyone is willing to learn, they can paint. But that willingness to learn is sometimes a lot to ask from people, because they're just so trained already to kind of excuse themselves or avoid changing themselves. That sort of refusal to admit that it's us that's the problem, that we can change and make things better. That's the only thing that holds people back, in my experience. That hard edge really helps there in popping out the harsh light scenario. I think one of the excuses that I've always hated people use is, oh, you can do it because you're young. I hear that one a lot, at least to some of my students, like you, who are doing a little better. It's always because you're young, not because you're spending more time at the easel or you've spent more time learning how to draw or anything. It's always because you're young. And certainly that implies different life scenarios, but if those people were willing to spend as much dedicated time learning, then they could feasibly be just as good. I've realized that I've started to get a little older now when people no longer say that excuse about me.
Oh, really?
Now I just get that it's transitioned from, oh, well, you're young, and now it's, oh, well, you've had a lot of years of experience. So I've started to bridge over into the other side. But it seems like it's using the reverse argument for excusing themselves for the same thing, right? Because I know a lot of people, and I have students who've been drawing and painting much longer than I have.
Oh, yeah.
So it's not about the years. It may be about the amount of time in those years and the amount of like really dedicated study.
Yeah, the amount of just hours would be very different. Would you say you started later compared to?
Later than the artists I know, yeah. For sure. I didn't start this until my mid-20s. And at that point, a lot of the people who I still do admire most were already in full swing in their careers. And to a degree that was good for me because I was able to see their progression and sort of gauge myself off of that. Like, working for this long before teaching, working this long before going to a gallery, starting in at this price point and they're at that price point now. It's sort of like a career guideline that I was able to draw up from various people that I admire. But certainly I would have loved to have started in my late teens and had an extra 7 or 8 years of practice under my belt. But, we all have our different paths.
I think everybody wishes they would start earlier.
Yeah.
No matter how early,
Right.
But do you think you could have been that dedicated when you were like...
If I had known what could come of it, probably.
But there's no way.
But there was ambiguity at that point. I didn't know at that time that people could paint like this still. Yeah, for me at that time, it was this idea that if I did painting, I would have to reinvent the wheel and figure everything out from scratch. Because I literally just didn't know that there were people out there doing this.
Who was there at that time that you were kind of entering into?
You mean when I first started painting, or when I was in my early 20s, late teens?
I guess when you first started painting.
Well, the people that I were really drawn to were out of a magazine called Masters of Realism, put out by American artists. And so that included Daniel Graves and Jeremy Lipking. There was a little snippet on Richard Schmid, even though it was just so tiny that at the time I didn't even notice it, and I came back later and realized he was in there. And I think those were pretty big influences because Daniel Graves showed that classical painting was alive, and then Lipking was doing stuff that resonated with me in a way I didn't understand at the time. Now I understand that he was drawing heavily from the French naturalists, and now they are my favorite group of painters. But that really pushed me forward because they look just so photorealistic And I assumed actually back then that he painted a lot tighter than he does until later when I actually saw him paint. And those were the guys when I first saw, I realized that people were, painting like this and it was possible. I mean, that's when I actually made the transition into painting. Once I had seen that there were people around doing this and that it was possible, and I wasn't going to have to completely figure it all out all over, that a lot of the legwork had been done. So I jumped into it.
So it sounds like you first went into it imagining it was bigger than most other people do. Because when I first found out about it, there's like this whole world and everybody was already in it. But you entering into it was like, oh, I'm going to have to, like, it's just me. I'm going to have to figure everything out.
Yeah, so that was like my late teens, early 20s. And at the time, I was still doing work in the hospital, and I was going to go to school in medicine. And so I figured, oh, well, I'll just do this on the side in my free time and work on this painting thing. Because I certainly didn't think you could make a living out of it. And that's everything I'd been told in high school and college was, oh, you can't make a living doing this unless you teach. And so I wasn't really interested in teaching at the time, which is kind of ironic because now I think I probably teach more than I would have otherwise. But that was sort of how I got into it. And I didn't, when I discovered that there were people painting and that there was this whole world here, I still didn't even realize how big the world was. I thought it was a relatively small group of people, and because of that, I figured, oh, well, this will be cake to jump right in and rise to the top, because there's a handful of people who can paint really well. And then, of course, I started to meet more people, and then social media exploded, and Instagram, and now you realize every day that there's amazing painters all over the world who are top-notch. And that you have to sort of reassess your desires about painting.
Is that around the time that the academic schools started getting bigger, like Florence and Grand Central?
I think they were already getting big then.
Really?
Yeah. There were already people coming out of there that were established and nice. Yeah. Putting in some of these final details here in the last couple minutes, so you can see with our close-up shot here just how unblended all of this paint is, and that's what's creating that juicy look, that light bouncing around, those tiny little bits of paint ridges and crevices. That's what we talk about when we make this analogy to Rembrandt, having this kind of paint buildup there, getting that sort of juicy paint quality. And so now I'm just going through, I have enough information on here, I can pretty much just soften out little bits here or there to just help facilitate some of the turning of the form and knock down some of the intensity of some of the hard edges that are on there, just to allow those highlights to sing a little bit and to really help give it a little bit more polish. I want there to be some varying contrast between the juiciness and the textural quality of those lights and the softness of the form as it rounds away. And this is, again, something that I don't really need to do with the model there. Part of it, too, is just stepping back and squinting, and if anything looks like it's too big of a jump, I might knock that down and soften it out a little bit. But certainly these little micro variations, especially of edges, are not something that from a distance of 15 feet away or so I could even be able to discern on the model.
This paint application seems like it's like higher level, like pretty hard to do. It takes a lot of economy of line, right? And just getting everything correct.
Yeah, I mean, there's some wiggle room because the intent is that you're going to hone in on correctness while you build up paint, but it is a thicker amount of paint, certainly, especially towards the end, and so it does require a pretty strong foundation to lay it on top of, and also really good understanding of your materials to be able to place the paint without disrupting paint quality. So yeah, I would say that this is a higher level of paint application technique, but certainly not beyond the scope of somebody even new to painting if this was their style that they were focusing on.
It looks really nice, I think.
Last little adjustments, and that's it.